Mercedes just did something in China that should not be possible under these rules. They didn't just win. They dominated every phase of the race. From the first lap to the last. No drop in performance. No visible energy limits. No mistakes. And here's the part that has the entire paddock talking. They never seemed to run out of power. Not once. While every other team was lifting, managing, losing speed at the end of straights, Mercedes kept pushing. Flat out. Lap after lap. And now, the FIA is taking a closer look. Because in this new era of Formula One, that kind of consistency is not normal. It's restricted. It's limited. It's controlled. Unless you found something others haven't. Or something that pushes the rules further than expected. And if that's true, this is not just about one race. This could change the entire season. So the real question is not how Mercedes won in China. The real question is, how were they able to do it without ever slowing down? What makes this even more serious is that it didn't just happen once. It happened the entire weekend. From the very first practice session, Mercedes looked different. Not just faster, more complete, more stable, more in control. And that's what started raising questions inside the paddock. Because under brand new regulations, no team is supposed to look that comfortable this early. Everyone else was still searching, still adjusting setups, still trying to understand how these new power units behave. But Mercedes arrived with something that already worked. And worked everywhere. Fast corners, slow corners, long straights, short bursts, no weakness, no compromise. And that's where the first real doubt appears. Because in Formula One, there is always a compromise. You gain in one area, you lose in another. That's the balance. That's the limitation built into the rules. But in China, Mercedes didn't look like they were trading anything. They gained everywhere. Now here's where things get even more interesting. Because the biggest advantage was not just speed. It was how long they could sustain it. Lap after lap, the same level. No drop in deployment. No sudden loss of energy at the end of straights. No visible signs of the system reaching its limit. And that's exactly what doesn't add up. Because every other team showed it. At some point in the lap, they had to manage, lift slightly, protect the system. But Mercedes didn't. And that's what triggered deeper analysis. Because when one team behaves differently, it's not ignored. It's studied. Now think about what happens behind the scenes. Engineers from other teams are already comparing data, looking at speed traces, energy deployment curves, trying to find where the difference is. And more importantly, why that difference exists. Because if they can't replicate it, they start questioning it. And that's when things escalate. Now bring the FIA into this. Because their role is not just to catch illegal parts. It's to understand behavior, patterns, trends, and when something doesn't match expectations, they look closer. Not aggressively, but carefully. And that's exactly what's happening now. Because the way Mercedes delivered power in China looked too clean, too consistent, too efficient. And in a system designed to limit efficiency, that stands out immediately. Now here's the key point. This doesn't mean Mercedes did anything wrong. But it does mean they might be operating in a way others are not. And that's enough. Enough to trigger attention. Enough to trigger analysis. Enough to trigger pressure. Because once you are the reference, everything you do becomes a benchmark. And a target. Now add another layer. Repeatability. Because one dominant race can be explained. Perfect setup. Perfect conditions. Everything coming together. But an entire weekend? That's different. That suggests something deeper. Something built into the car. Into the system. Into how everything works together. And that's exactly what the FIA wants to understand. Now imagine the situation Mercedes is in. They have the fastest car. The most complete package. But now, they are also the most observed team. Every lap. Every run. Every data point. Under scrutiny. And that changes everything. Because now, it's not just about being fast. It's about proving that your speed is sustainable. And within the limits. So the real tension starts here. Not in China. But after China. Because the next race becomes a test. A comparison. A confirmation. If Mercedes shows up and looks exactly the same, then they are simply ahead. But if something changes, if that perfect consistency disappears, if the car starts to show limits like everyone else, then we will know that what we saw in China was not just performance. It was something that forced the entire sport to look closer. But just when it seems like this is only about performance, the situation starts to evolve into something much bigger. Because now, it's not just the FIA looking. It's everyone. Every team. Every engineer. Every analyst in the paddock. All focused on one thing. Mercedes. And in Formula One, that's when things start to change. Because when rivals don't understand an advantage, they don't accept it. They challenge it. Quietly at first. Then more directly. Now imagine what's happening behind closed doors. Red Bull is comparing data. Ferrari is studying every straight. McLaren is analyzing energy traces. All asking the same question. Where's that extra consistency coming from? Because if they can't find it, they will push the FIA to define it. And that's where the pressure really begins. Because the FIA doesn't just act on what they see. They act on what the grid questions. And when multiple teams start pointing at the same thing, the investigation goes deeper, more detailed, more precise. Now connect this to what we saw in China. Mercedes didn't just win. They removed uncertainty. No pressure from behind. No internal fight. No strategic risk. Everything was controlled. And that kind of control is exactly what creates discomfort in Formula One. Because this sport is built on limits, on trade-offs, on imperfection. But in China, Mercedes looked almost perfect. And perfection, in a restricted system, always raises questions. Now here's where everything shifts. Because the FIA doesn't need to find something illegal to intervene. They only need to find something unclear. Something that sits in a gray area. And once that happens, they clarify it. They redefine it. They close it. And when they do, the teams that were benefiting the most, lose the most. Immediately. Now imagine that scenario. If Mercedes is extracting performance from a very specific interpretation, a precise way of managing energy, and that interpretation gets adjusted, even slightly, the effect is instant. The car feels different. The performance drops. The advantage shrinks. And suddenly, the gap disappears. Not because Mercedes became slow, but because the system around them changed. Now add another layer. Psychological pressure. Because now, Mercedes is not just racing. They are defending something. Their concept. Their understanding of the rules. Their advantage. And that creates a different environment. Engineers become more cautious. Decisions become more conservative. And without realizing it, you start losing the edge. Just enough for others to close in. Now bring the drivers back into focus. Antonelli, coming off a dominant win. Russell, securing maximum points. Both entering the next race with confidence. But also, with awareness. Because they know, everything is being watched. Every straight. Every acceleration. Every lap. And that changes how you approach a race. Even if you don't say it. Because when you know the spotlight is on you, you don't just perform. You prove. And that's a completely different mindset. Now here's the turning point. Because this is where the next race becomes critical. Not just another round. A comparison. A test. If Mercedes shows up, and looks exactly the same, then the message is clear. They are ahead, and nothing changes. But if even a small part of that advantage disappears, if the consistency breaks, if the car starts to behave more like the others, then we will know that what we saw in China was not just dominance. It was something that forced the sport to react. And maybe, something the sport decided, needed to be controlled. And yet, even with all of this pressure building around Mercedes, there is one final piece of the puzzle that could decide everything. Because this is no longer just about speed. It's about how Formula One reacts when one team goes too far ahead. Not illegally. Not obviously. But just enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Because the sport has seen this before. A team finds something. Something small. Something clever. Something that gives them an edge. At first, it looks like brilliance. Then it becomes dominance. And eventually, it becomes a problem. Not because it breaks the rules, but because it stretches them. And when that happens, the FIA always responds. Carefully, quietly, but effectively. They don't need penalties. They don't need controversy. All they need is a clarification. A small change. A new interpretation. And suddenly, the advantage disappears. Now imagine that scenario for Mercedes. Right now. At the start of a new era. If their performance in China came from a very precise way of using the system, a specific interaction between power, energy, and deployment, then even the smallest adjustment changes everything. Because they are not just losing speed. They are losing the method that creates that speed. And that is much harder to recover. Now think about the consequences. The car feels different. The balance shifts. The energy doesn't last the same way. The consistency breaks. And suddenly, What looked effortless becomes difficult. Now bring this back to the bigger picture. Because the rest of the grid is ready, waiting. If Mercedes keeps their advantage, everyone will try to copy it. But if that advantage gets limited, everyone benefits, except Mercedes. And that's why this moment is so critical. Because it's not just about one team being fast. It's about whether that speed is allowed to stay. Now add one more layer. Momentum. Because right now, Mercedes has it all. Confidence, results, control. But momentum in Formula One is fragile. It depends on stability, on continuity, on being able to repeat what you've already done. And if something changes, even slightly, momentum disappears. Fast. Now imagine the next race. Same cars, same drivers, but a different environment. More scrutiny, more pressure, more attention, and maybe small changes behind the scenes. The kind you don't see, but you feel. And that's when everything becomes clear. Because Formula One always reveals the truth over time. Not in one race, but in what follows. So now, we are at the real turning point. Not the dominance in China. Not the investigation itself. But what happens next? Because if Mercedes shows up, and looks just as fast, just as consistent, just as untouchable, then there is no debate. They are ahead, and everyone else is chasing. But if something changes, if the car looks just a little more limited, if the gap closes, if the dominance fades, then we will understand what China really was. Not just a victory, not just a statement, but a moment. A moment where Mercedes reached the peak, right before the sport pushed back. And if all of this still feels uncertain, still feels like speculation, there is one final reality that cannot be ignored. Formula One always exposes the truth. Not immediately, but inevitably. Because no team can hide behind one perfect weekend. Not anymore. The data is too detailed. The analysis is too deep. The scrutiny is too constant. And when a team shows something that stands out, the sport responds. Every time. Now think about what that means for Mercedes going forward. They are no longer just the fastest team. They are the reference point. The benchmark. The team everyone is measuring themselves against. And that comes with a cost. Because now, every small detail matters. If they are slightly slower in the next race, people will notice. If their energy drops earlier, people will question it. If the gap to Ferrari or Red Bull closes, people will connect it. Everything becomes a signal. Everything becomes evidence. And that's the environment they are now operating in. Now here's the key moment. Because this is where the season starts to define itself. Not in China, but in what comes after. Because if Mercedes repeats that performance, if they show the same control, the same consistency, the same dominance, then there is no doubt. They didn't just find speed. They understood the system better than anyone else. And at that point, the rest of the grid is in trouble. Real trouble. But if they don't, if even a small part of that advantage disappears, if the car looks more limited, more normal, more like the others, then the conclusion changes completely. Because then China becomes something else. Not the beginning of dominance, but the peak of an interpretation. The moment where everything aligned, right before the sport adjusted. And that is the difference that decides championships. Not who is fastest once, but who can stay fastest. When the rules, the pressure, and the competition all start pushing back. So now, everything comes down to this. The next race is not just another race. It's the answer. The answer to whether Mercedes is truly ahead, or whether what we saw in China was something the sport itself was never going to allow to continue. And if that answer starts to appear, you won't need an official statement. You won't need a penalty.